Am I allowed to say your name?
Yeah.
Okay.
Give it a gap before we kick off, and then I'll get it downstairs. I mean, I can give it to you and you can edit it, or I can edit it.
Okay.
And I'll watch the time so that we don't go over the 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, Paul. In your experience, what language issues do international students have when they study on a postgraduate course?
I know you're going to ask me about cultural issues, and I think that the cultural issues are the things that hit me the most that they're dealing with. And strangely, those cultural issues that international students are dealing with are, in fact, quite similar, or have similarities with the experience that native speakers have, is adjusting to an academic environment and the expectations there. Over the years, we were very hot on the IELTS score. At one time, we were demanding a 7. We don't now, we ask for a 6.5, and part of the reason was that we felt the students were adapting quite quickly to the language expectations of the course. Not all of them, but the majority. It was the other cultural issues that were most significant. But if I was to answer the question, what language issues are key, I would say reading.
Okay.
Coping with the reading demands of a
Okay.
postgraduate course are really challenging. You expect it to be writing, but we can provide them with writing support.
Right.
We can deal with that, but we can't be at their elbow as they
Yeah.
work on the reading.
I think that's challenging to a native speaker,
Exactly.
actually.
Yeah.
So, okay, going over back to the cultural issues that you mentioned, what can you sort of...
Yeah, sure. Okay, and again, this I think it's an issue for British students as well. It's the whole issue of criticality, that there is an expectation perhaps that education that students may have had before has, to varying degrees, been about learning bits of information and then being able to repeat those bits of information, and not having the expectations that the students themselves will be expected to ask questions, that they will be expected to be critical of what they read, of what they're told. These are things that are really challenging. The attitude you're dealing with, and I understand it, is, well, you're the teacher, you know, you tell me, I'll learn it, and then you can test me to see if I've learnt it. And it's just not what's expected.
Right.
Certainly at this level, but I'd argue within the British educational environment, that's not really, at its best, it's not what's expected either.
Right. And so I suppose that it goes against what their expectations. If they come from a country maybe where they're expected not to question and just to absorb and, you know, follow the same model and not challenge any model, then it must be a huge surprise.
It is, but then, I mean, I could almost turn the question back to you. To what degree has it been a bit of a surprise to you as a British student? Because I wouldn't want to say that this is something exclusive to international students. It's something that a lot of British students share.
Maybe. I think it depends on your life experience, because it was less of a surprise for me because of, I've got 10 years working in the field, working with other professionals and being used to challenging new ideas that come into the business. I can imagine possibly someone who is gone from an undergrad degree straight from A levels and then onto a master's who's had a very tiny amount of work experience or life experience. It might be more of a challenge. Do you think it takes postgrad students on international students on postgrad courses? Do you think it takes them longer to adapt to this way of studying?
It's entirely variable.
Personal, I suppose, to each student.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, in my experience, they get there, but it's a cultural expectation that we're placing on them. I recognise that, and I'd be hesitant to sort of talk about rights and wrongs. I'm thinking of my own experience studying in Japan, because I studied Aikido, and there were certain expectations placed on me of how I was expected to behave.
So I suppose it's, you know, the learning curve. It's how well you can adapt to the steep learning curve and keep up with it. Helps you with success on the course. Okay. Final question: what advice, if any, would you give to someone whose first language wasn't English and who's living overseas, who's thinking of studying in the UK, to help prepare them for maybe?
It seems very challenging. Certainly, I've worked with some of the students on the course who've been thinking. They've been thinking about how can I learn from my experience having to adapt to this environment, and if when I go back home, how could I prepare a course which allowed students to cope with the demands of both life and study?
Right.
And it's a huge issue of developing cultural awareness.
Right.
But I think those cultures extend to the thing that I'm always talking about, which is students' experiences on buses, which can be different because things happen on a bus in this area that don't happen in London and don't maybe happen back home. And it's a point where the students are interacting with the local community, and they constantly pass comments on this, that they need to adapt to the community, types of behaviour that are in the community, so these don't shock or disturb. It's culture shock. It is culture shock. It's classic culture shock, but it's happening on all sorts of levels. Arrive, where do I get my food?
Yeah.
How do I cook my food? What is it that people eat here?
I imagine they would be. I'd imagine they would get guidance on that beforehand. If you know, I'm not talking about any particular university, but for me that would be common sense for any business to send out those kind of guidance.
Well, I'm sure that all British universities do this. They will provide in-depth support. I mean, when students arrive in the country, they're actually met at the airport.
Right.
So they will be provided with all sorts of information, but at that point they're on information overload.
Right.
And there's only a certain amount they can take in, and whether they're British or whether they're international, you can provide information.
It's the experience that makes it. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But it's also the degree to which they engage with that information. I mean, you can give someone a welcome pack. That's no guarantee that they're going to work their way through it.
Okay.
They're making calls back home. They're sending emails back home. They're dealing with other things, and maybe they're not accessing their welcome pack. So the support has to be multi-layered, and you have to sort of push people towards it.
Okay. Okay, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.